Well, it's a pleasure to have Professor Mahta Moghaddam from USC as our colloquium speaker today. I'll give a brief bio and we'll proceed with the talk. Mahta Moghaddam is a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Southern California. Until 2011, she was at the University of Michigan. She received a PhD degree in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Illinois in Urbana in 1991. From 1991 to 2003, she was with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. During the past 20 years of active involvement in environmental remote sensing, Dr. Moghaddam has introduced a number of new approaches for quantitative interpretation of synthetic aperture radar imagery. Her most recent contributions include the development of new radar measurement technologies for subsurface and subcanopy characterization, development of forward and inverse scattering techniques for layered random media with rough interfaces, developing sensor web technologies for in situ environmental sensing, and transforming concepts of radar remote sensing into high-resolution medical imaging. She's a member of the NASA Soil Moisture Active and Passive SMAP Mission Science Definition Team, chair of the SMAP Algorithms Working Group, and a PI for Airmass, a NASA Earth Ventures mission. She's a fellow of the IEEE and a member of the NASA Advisory Council Earth Science Subcommittee. Please welcome her to the UW. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peyman. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Very glad to be with you today. I wanted to go over some of the research that's going on in my group right now with regards to environmental remote sensing and how it can help us address some of the current grand challenges of climate research. And in particular, I'll be talking about the technologies that have to do with sensing the subsurface using microwaves. And I would like to acknowledge some of my group members. If I can get my cursor to work. I've listed them here in alphabetical order, and these are the group, those in my group who work on this particular topic. Some of them are graduate students, a couple of them are postdocs. So let me first define the problem that we are addressing, and then we'll talk about some of the solutions and some of the results. So let me define environmental sensing in a very broad sense as the characterization of properties of objects without disturbing them or without disturbing their immediate surroundings. Okay, so this is the sensing them remotely or at least from a short distance without disturbing them. And we have used, or the coral community has used electromagnetic and acoustic waves for this purpose. And of course, we're going to focus mostly on electromagnetic waves here. And in the microwave regime in particular, EM waves offer an optimum means for doing this non-invasive sensing. And you might have heard of many applications using microwaves, for example, resource exploration. Oil companies, for example, use the technologies, construction technology. So in civil engineering, you see a lot of applications for non-destructive sensing using microwaves, medical imaging, of course, and last but not least, remote sensing of the terrestrial environment. Now, let me define two different types of sensing problems. One is what I'm going to call the proximal sensing, and in the next slide, I'll talk about remote sensing. Okay, the proximal sensing problem would be, for example, the class of problems I've shown in these two pictures. Let's say you have an object here you're trying to characterize without disturbing it. You could, let's assume you could place receivers and transmitters, so T's would be transmitters, R would be receivers, in the vicinity of this object. This would be, for example, a medical imaging type problem. You have the human body, you're trying to figure out what's inside of it. Maybe you're just doing some diagnostics. And so the characteristic of this type of proximal problem are that the object is on the order of the sensing wavelength. Okay, so it's the confined sized, a small sized object confined to a given area. You have good measurement access to this object, so you could feel free to place transmitters and receivers in various locations around the object. You could perform multi-static measurements, which means that you could put a transmitter somewhere and have all kinds of receivers around it. So you have a pretty vast measurement space. Okay? The object in this type of problem is mostly deterministic. So for a given target, it can be considered deterministic. So for example, if you have one person as your patient, you're trying to do medical image diagnostics, For that one person, it's a deterministic problem. Among people, it may not be, but for that one person, it is, because the object is well located. Okay? The sensing resolution is generally limited by the highest probing frequency. And so this type of problem really is ideal for forming what we call the forward and inverse scattering solutions. The forward problem would be that if you knew what the target was, and if you sent an electromagnetic wave or microwave to it, then you could predict what waves it would scatter. The inverse problem would be the opposite, basically that you don't know what the object is. You would send the signal, you would receive the scattered signal, and from the received signal, you would try to decipher what the object is. So this type of proximal sensing problem is ideal for forming that kind of, defining that kind of a problem. Okay? And you could have full view, 360 view, or you could have partial view, for example, 180-degree view. Now, let's go to the remote sensing problem. These problems are a little bit more complicated, okay, in the sense that the object, first of all, is remote. We're talking about tens of kilometers, maybe hundreds of kilometers away. Okay, let's say if you are trying to remotely sense a forested region and you're flying in an aircraft or a spacecraft, you could be quite far away. You're talking about many, many, many wavelengths, thousands, millions of wavelengths, depending on your frequency of sensing. Okay. The object also in this case is no longer a deterministic object, it's a random object. Because nature is very random. You're talking about very large number of scatterers in the scene, which form pretty much a random object. Also, only backscatter measurements are possible. You no longer have the luxury of putting a lot of receivers and transmitters around the object, but you have one system, one transmitter and receiver at the same time as you're flying. So you just basically have one chance of observing your target. So it becomes overall a much more difficult problem. Okay? But I guess on the other hand, the type of information that we need to extract from these problems is also different. In a medical imaging problem or the proximal sensing problem, basically you really want to characterize the boundaries of this object, the material construct of that given object. So you really want a lot of detailed information about a given object. But in remote sensing, we want bulk properties. We want densities, for example. We want distributions. We want statistical properties of these targets. So again, the nature of information is different, and that's what really helps us get any handle on this type of very complicated problems. So here, what we're going to do in this talk is we will focus on radar as our sensing instrument. So imagine you have a radar on an aircraft or a spacecraft. It transmits and receives waves. And in particular, we'll focus on synthetic aperture radar systems, or SAR systems, which offer very high resolution in sensing. And the resolution of a radar system or a SAR system is determined primarily by its bandwidth. Okay, so it's inversely proportional to its bandwidth. The larger the bandwidth, the finer the resolution we can get. Okay. All right, now why do we want to study the remote sensing problem? Should be probably very clear to you, but let me just say a few things about why we want to do this from an environmental perspective. Global climate change, some would argue, is very evident, but how it's changing or quantifying it is very controversial. So I don't think anyone agrees on how it's changing, but you might agree it's changing, but we don't know how, which direction, how much. Okay, so we have a lot of qualitative analyses, but it's been very hard to put numbers on these changes. And our role as engineers and scientists is really to help people quantify that. And radar remote sensing is one of the ways in which we can do that. So the way we do it is to find quantitative information about the environment. It's very challenging. There are too many unknowns. There are too few observations. Okay, the relationships between the observations and the unknowns is highly complex and nonlinear. Mathematically, it's nonlinear relationships. So it's pretty hard to do, but we need to do it because we need to know the Earth system variables quantitatively in order to understand, to help the scientists understand this climate change issue. And that has motivated many missions over the years. Going back to the late 70s, NASA launched its first L-band satellite, and then many others have followed it. Oops. And there's another one upcoming in a couple of years from now, SMAP, the Soil Moisture Active Passive Mission, which is going to be launched by NASA. It has both active and passive microwave instruments on it. And that will also help us further quantify some of the parameters of the environment. Okay. Now, there are many unknowns in the environment, and we can't possibly invert for all of them. So let's just focus on a few things. Let me talk about a couple of the grand challenges of climate. And I'll go through this introductory things quick because I want to get to the technical parts of this talk. But let me just give you an idea of the level of the problems that the scientists are having to deal with. Don't worry about the fine print here. Let's kind of take an impressionistic view of this picture. Okay, these are the different bar charts you see here are the predictions of various carbon, the so-called carbon models. So different groups across the country, across the globe have numerical models for predicting what's happening to the carbon balance of the Earth. And of course, depending on the model they use and the inputs to those models, they come up with very different results. Okay, so each of these charts is from different groups. And you see that not only they don't agree, but sometimes they disagree by 100%. Sometimes the direction in which the different models are going are different, so the signs of the estimates sometimes doesn't even match up. Okay, so bottom line is that it's a very poorly understood problem, the whole carbon balance, and no wonder there's so much controversy around it. Okay, some of the most important unknowns or parameters that go into these models are, for example, if I can get my mouse back here somewhere. Okay, it's there. Okay, so we have vegetation properties of the environment and also the soil properties, and in particular the root zone soil, because plants need water to function and they need water at their roots. So root zone, the so-called root zone soil moisture is one of the most important parameters, plus the vegetation on top. So if from remote sensing we can provide these unknowns to the scientists, we've done them a great service because we will let them close the gap between the different model predictions. Okay, so let me just bring all these up. Okay, another issue is the global water cycle. Okay, the global water cycle basically determines how much water comes down as rain, how much of it gets evaporated, how much of it runs off, how much of it gets stored. So basically the whole balance between the different partitions of water. And the energy cycle comes in here too, because how much radiation you have on the surfaces also determines what happens to the water. And that also is very poorly understood. Among the reasons that it's poorly understood is also that the scientists don't have enough information on what goes into their models. So some of the most important parameters that they're looking for are surface to depth profiles of soil moisture, okay, and as far as we're concerned, groundwater, and snow and ice cover, and so on and so forth. Okay, so again, they don't have observations to quantify these things, and a lot of times they just guess at a lot of these variables, and that's how we really come into the picture. Okay, so now let's talk about how we can provide information for these scientists from our engineering perspective, and in particular from our electromagnetics and microwave sensing perspective. Okay, so what I've shown you here on the bottom right is an actual radar image. This is an airborne radar that collected data over a forested area in Canada. The colors come from the RGB, red, green, blue. It's an overlay of 3 different frequencies of observation, which are C-band, L-band, and P-band. So we go from wavelengths from 5 centimeters to about 24 centimeters to about 68 centimeters. Okay, so that gives you the color scheme. Let's not really worry about that. I just wanted to show you this picture because it shows you the variety of landscape that you could have. And each type of landscape gives you a different radar backscatter level, and that's, that becomes kind of evident in the different colors that you see. For example, I've shown you the bright area in the middle comes from this very tall pine stand. This a little bit darker, kind of purplish color, which again, it's just a 3-color overlay of these frequencies, comes from a small stand. So this is basically the radar's perspective of this diverse environment. Okay, Now, let's, again, we're kind of working our way down to where we can solve this problem with electromagnetics. Okay, so that was the radar view. So that's what the instrument saw. You could go to the field and use various instruments to come up with a digitized view of this environment. Okay, this is a different forest, but let's say you could, for example, if you had a laser scanner, you could scan your environment and come up with this digitized view. Okay, now this is the electromagnetic modeler's view of the same scene. Okay. Now, what we do, if we want to model, if we want to make any sense of it, we have to break this problem down. Okay, so that's why we break this problem down into smaller pieces. Trees become cylinders, basically, become a collection of cylinders. Okay, and we do that because we know how to solve, well, it's a qualified we know, but let's say we know how to solve or predict the scattering, the radar scattering from, let's say, a cylinder. And then once we put cylinders or other simple canonical shape objects together, we basically construct our full scattering scene. So our trees basically become, again, if I can get my cursor back, all right. So the trees become collections of cylinders. The trunks are vertical cylinders, the branches are randomly oriented. And then it turns out that from a random medium perspective, it doesn't matter if we put the cylinders here connected to a tree, or we just distribute them across one resolution cell of our sensing instrument. The results are more or less the same. Within some approximations, the results are the same. And this, essentially, this bottom problem is what we end up solving, okay, from a radar modeler's, electromagnetic modeler's perspective. Okay. So this is, again, just to give you more detail, the tree becomes a collection of cylinders or disks or whatever other canonical objects that are relevant. We have, of course, a forest floor, which is a rough surface. You could have water bodies like lakes or rivers. And then the crops also can get modeled essentially in the same way. Okay, so again, we can go around the environment and kind of put our little modeling units there to get a handle on this problem. Okay, and then at the end, what happens? Well, the radar waves, when they come back to us, they are, you can think of them as coming from different contributions from the different parts of this scene. Okay, so for example, so that's the bottom, the floor, the forest floor, for example, and that's a rough surface, so that's the first contribution, that's number one. So the second contribution can come from the vegetation canopies, okay? The third contribution comes from the interaction of either the canopy and the ground or the trunks and the ground. So it's basically a bunch of interactions that go on. And again, once again, the concept is to divide and conquer. We decompose the full scattering problem into components, and we solve for each one separately, and then at the end, we add them up. Okay, and this very general equation on top describes how we do the separation, and then we add them up again. So M standing for, so that's just a matrix that describes it's a Mueller matrix. It defines the total scattered power from the point of view of the radar, and that's composed of the various contributions. All these terms are the contributions of the various parts of this canopy, okay? So we call each one of these a mechanism. So the surface is a scattering mechanism. The volume scattering from the crowns that's another mechanism. The double bounce between the canopy or between the trunks and the ground, that's another mechanism. It's just the lingo that's used in the community. Okay, so now let's say that with this model that I showed in the previous page, with this model, let's say we can predict what the radar sees. Okay, so if I can define my scattering scene, if I knew exactly what I had, if I knew the trees and the surface and all that, okay, through these models, let's say I can predict what I measure. But we don't have that. We only have the measurement. We don't have the scene. In fact, that's the goal. We want to go from the measurements to the scene. What do we do? There's so many unknowns. I mean, these trees have hundreds of branches. Each one has a different length, a different diameter, and there's so many trees, the surface itself. So if you just put all these numbers together, you end up with tens of unknowns. clearly we don't have tens of measurements. We only have a handful of measurements, and from all these measurements, we have to retrieve the information about the ground. Well, so we have to come up with a new strategy to retrieve these unknowns. Well, what do we do? The basic strategy is that imagine, so this surface D, which is your data, okay, it's probably not sensitive to every single parameter in the scene. Okay, and we can show this by running our scattering models over large ranges of parameters. You could show that it's not really sensitive to all of these things. It's sensitive to several key variables. For example, the height of the trees. Okay, that's important. How many trees you have, that's important. Okay, what kind of surface you have is very important. But it doesn't really matter, how many leaves or what's the exact size of the leaves and so on and so forth. So we really have to pick our battle in this case. That's really the bottom line. We have to do some homework to know which unknowns we're shooting for. Okay, and it turns out, again, as I said, just a few, maybe 3, maybe 4 of them that are important. So what happens then is that we can define our space of measurements, in this case D, our data, okay, as a function of those key unknowns. Here I've shown you 3 axes to this data space. You could have maybe 4, maybe 5 dimensions to this space. I couldn't show anything more than 3, obviously. So let's say if we have 3 unknowns that are important, and let's call them the roughness of the surface. Let's call the second one, for example, the density of trees. And let's call the third one the height of these trees. Okay? Or could be another set depending on the specific scene we're looking at. Okay, so we already talked about that. You talked about the data space. So what we're going to do is that from our very complex numerical model that I showed in the previous page, where we add all the cylinders and we add up all the scattering mechanisms and so forth, we basically follow the following strategy, that we numerically generate a data space as a function of those key parameters. Okay, again, we numerically generate D that I've shown you there. Okay, once you numerically generate it, then what can be done is that then we fit in closed form nonlinear functions to that space. Okay, you will ask, okay, why? You already have a numerical model, which is hopefully accurate. Why would you have to do another set of function fitting? Well, once you have a closed form function, then it makes your retrieval job or the inversion job at the end much, much easier, because now you have an analytical function. You don't have to do a numerical search for the solution anymore. If you have the closed form function, then you can much more easily retrieve what those unknowns like x1, x2, and x3 are. Okay? So one function that we have found one form of function that we found very useful is a polynomial. A polynomial is very useful because, first, I mean, it's easy to generate. So if you have a data space, it's easy to come up with the coefficients of polynomials. Okay? And the second reason is that very easily a polynomial can capture nonlinear effects in a functional space. Okay? So we can choose to do second order, third order, fourth order polynomials depending on what kind of nonlinearity we expect to see in a given data space. Okay, so let's say that we did that. So we start from our complex Maxwell equation-based electromagnetic model. We generate a data space. We fit closed form functional forms to data space, which are polynomials. Okay, and then we start the retrieval. The retrieval process is basically estimating those unknowns like x1, x2, x3 from our closed form solutions. And that becomes, I mean, that's just an estimation problem. There are so many different techniques of solving an estimation problem. Okay, so we have basically simplified this problem from a fully numerical model to a simple parameter estimation problem. Okay, so the parameter estimation problem, if you have taken courses or otherwise in your research you have done it, it's basically minimizing what's called a cost function. So you define a measure of similarity between your measurements and your model predictions. Okay, you want to minimize something you want to minimize the difference between your measurement and the model in such a way that gives you an optimal solution to your unknowns. So L being a cost function, f is your function, your numerical function. In the previous chart, you could think of that space D as your function f. D0 here is the data that you have. And the second term, this term here, is what we call a regularization term. And that comes from any prior knowledge that you might have from your unknowns. Okay? And then you could choose your favorite way of solving for this cost or minimizing this cost function. You could choose a local optimizer. You could use a global optimizer. Local optimizers are fast, but they could have some instability or problems or converging to the wrong minimum problems. Global optimizations are very nice, very accurate, but very time consuming. So you could choose to do what you like. Here I've again kind of an eye chart strategy. If you want to do a local optimizer through a conjugate gradient scheme, for example, that's the kind of procedure that you would follow. So let me show you some examples of how we have applied this kind of technique to the same scene. So this, if you remember the radar image in a few slides back that I was talking about with the 3-frequency overlay, this is that same area. Well, this tiny square, that's the area of the image I showed you a while ago. That image was basically this piece right here where the cursor is. Okay. So we ran through, the technique that I was just talking about, and just to give you some example results, this is a 3D rendition of tree height maps. So this is a retrieved tree height map from that area. And if you look at, unfortunately, the red on black is not coming through very well, but if you see this red transect here along the cursor, these are these numbers, okay? So this is, again, the tree height as you go from one stand to the next stand to the next stand. So you see the kind of the choppy behavior just because different stands have different tree heights. That's one example. This is, let me see. Okay. This is a map of tree stem density. Remember, I defined 3 key variables for this particular problem. You could choose other key variables. It was the tree height, the stem density, and soil moisture. Okay, so again, this red transect is shown here in the bottom. That's the map of tree stem densities. And this is the map of soil moisture. And once again, this red transect here is shown in the bottom figure there, and it shows the variations of soil moisture as you walk through the canopy. And we have validated these values in the field. Of course, not at every point, but we've had samples, and we've had collaborators who've taken samples in the field. And we have shown very good accuracy with these techniques. So all fine. Let's say that we consider this a solved problem, and it's not even a solved problem yet. I mean, these are just examples. You can never claim that you've fully solved the problem. There's always research topics kind of hidden among everything that I've said here. But let's say that the general strategy we agree on. Okay, we go from scattering models to these simplified solutions to the retrieval, to the parameter estimation techniques. Okay, so let's say we solve the problem, for example, for above the surface. What do we do about the subsurface? I started my talk, the title of the talk is Subsurface. Okay, so how do we get there? So the purpose of showing everything on the top to you first was that we have to deal with that problem first before we get to the bottom, before we get to the subsurface problem. And also, it turns out that the strategy we applied to the above surface retrieval problem also applies to the below surface retrieval problem. It's very, very similar. Okay, let's think about what happens to the signal as it enters the subsurface. You could, on the left, I've shown you a case where you just have a bare surface. Think Arizona. There's nothing on top of the surface, or it's very dry, so microwaves don't really see it. But let's say that we have some structure under the surface, and we're interested in that because, for example, this is where water could be. There could be some groundwater resources that we're interested in. If you do have trees on top, okay, then of course we can think about that problem too. But the idea is this, that as the waves enter the surface, Okay, it's a rough surface, so some part of it goes forward. You don't ever see it because your radar is looking from this direction. You shine the waves, and some part of it comes back in backscatter, but a lot of it goes away. So that's lost energy. We don't see it. Some part of it goes through the surface, and if there are layers under the surface, the wave could interact with those subsurface layers. It interacts with subsurface layers. That's also another rough surface, and some part of it comes back, some part of it goes forward. So you get the gist of this. So there's a lot of interactions under the surface, and there could be inclusions like rocks or void spaces and so forth. So they all contribute to this backscattering process. If you have the trees actually function in two different ways. The first thing that people have talked about a lot in the past is that the trees kind of mask the surface. They introduce an attenuating layer, and therefore people for a long time were saying that trees basically just attenuate the signal so you can't see anything from the subsurface. Well, that might be true in some cases, especially if you have higher frequencies, that's true. But if you have lower frequencies, they actually penetrate through the canopy, they hit the tree trunks, they bounce, they hit the surface, and they go through multiple interactions in the subsurface, and they trace the same path back and go back to your radar. So, and now we have seen this in actual radar measurements, that trees could, in fact, enhance the scattering from the subsurface. And that has been very useful in terms of getting information from the subsurface in the presence of very large trees. Okay, so it's kind of against conventional wisdom, but it's true. Okay. But the key is that we have to use low enough frequencies to allow that. If you have very, very high frequencies, sure, they get absorbed the top layer of canopy, and it's done. Okay, so you could do very simple, basically back of the envelope calculations, do skin depth calculations, and figure out what frequencies you need for a given application. I've shown you soil moisture. Of course, soil moisture and dielectric constant are highly related to each other. So high soil moisture, imagine that means high dielectric constant, high loss. Okay, and here you see different frequencies, gigahertz range versus hundreds of megahertz range. All of a sudden, you see a huge increase in the penetration depth. Okay, let me skip that figure. Okay, so how do we solve this problem? So my group has worked quite a bit in the past few years on developing models for subsurface structures. So we've developed several different techniques for layered random subsurfaces. And so I'll talk about only one of them briefly. The other ones are simpler, but I chose the one that's a little bit more complicated to talk about. And it's so people have worked on these types of problems using analytical methods, numerical methods, and hybrid between numerical and analytical methods. Analytical methods are great because they're fast, but they have huge assumptions usually. So their domain of validity is usually very small. Numerical techniques are very good because of their high accuracy, but they're very slow because these problems are very large. And numerically, they're very large, so they take a very long time for the solution to come out. Semi-analytical methods are pretty good balance in between. And I would categorize what I'm talking about in more of the semi-analytical, semi-numerical category. Okay, so let's say that you have the picture on right. You have a layered surface like you have everywhere. Basically, if you dig soil, you will see that the soil is layered. So that's a very representative picture on the right. Okay, the solution that we have come up with is based on the so-called extended boundary condition method. And I don't know if you guys have taken courses, and this would be an advanced electromagnetic course. So you're probably, from your undergraduate electromagnetics, you're familiar with the boundary conditions, that the tangential electric and magnetic fields have to be continuous across the boundary. Okay, the extended boundary condition method basically extends, as it's called, it extends the boundary a little bit away from the actual physical boundary so that it's easier to impose the boundary conditions. Okay, so an exact boundary condition, let me say, for a rough surface is very difficult because your surface is randomly rough. So it's impossible for you to know where exactly that surface is. Okay, whereas if you extend the boundary, and if you apply the continuity boundary conditions on an extended surface, then it just becomes a little easier to solve. On top of that, we also assume that in the lateral direction, we have a periodic surface. And it's not like periodic in the sense of sinusoidal periodic. It's just that whatever huge rough surface you have, just imagine that you repeat this rough surface. Okay, it's just a mathematical convenience. It doesn't mean that your surface actually has to be periodic. So anyways, by using those tricks and going through some steps that start from Maxwell's equations and write the scattered field in terms of an integral equation, okay, we can write the scattered field as in terms of the equivalent currents that are generated at the extended boundaries. Okay, then we apply the so-called extinction theorem. Okay, and from that, with the assumption that we have a very large periodic surface, okay, we can write the solution in terms of a summation of these basis functions. I mean, numerically, if you know about numerical algorithms, you know that they expand the integral equation in terms of basis functions. Here, our basis functions are, I'm only calling them basis functions, but they're expansion functions, or flow K modes. Flow K modes are plane wave functions, basically. Okay, so you have, and they're modes because, or they become modes because we have a periodic surface. We have imposed a periodic surface on this problem. Okay, so we expand the field in terms of these flow K modes. We solve for the coefficients of these flow K modes, and which let us then find the total scattered field through the solution of that above integral. Okay, so so that's for one surface. To get the solution for multiple surfaces, what we do is that we apply the concept of scattering matrices and cascading the scattering matrices. If you've had network or circuits courses, or you've solved network problems, you're familiar with this type of chart, the S parameters of a two-port network, for example. Okay, so it's basically the same thing. You cascade the S parameters or scattering matrices of the different surfaces, and that allows you to get the scattering picture for the whole geometric construct. Okay. So just to show you some examples, if you have, let's look at some of the details here. So you have two layers, let's say here, and your top is free space. The second layer has permittivity of 5 for the real part, 0.44 for the imaginary part. The third layer is a little bit denser medium. And of course, you could vary all these parameters as you like. It's like infinite space of variations you could have here. And then you could move these surfaces up and down just to look at the sensitivity of what happens to the backscattering process as various medium parameters change. So the different colors you see here, the red is where the second layer is 30 centimeters deep. The green, which is, you can't really see it here because it's very close to the blue, at 50, and the blue is at 100 centimeters. So if you zoom in a little bit, this shows it a little better. So you see that, and the backscatter direction is at 40 degrees. These simulations were done at 40 degrees. So you see that there is a slight variation, maybe about a dB or so variation. That's the level of sensitivity to have with these parameters. Of course, you could change your parameters and get different levels of sensitivity. But the bottom line is that it matters. So it really matters how you model your subsurface, and that you have to have a model for the subsurface, or you could be committing errors if you don't do that. Now, the next problem that we are solving is that, of course, the subsurface, if you have trees, they have roots, and these roots are electromagnetically very important because they have very high permittivity. They have much higher permittivity than the soil around them. So they alter the effective dielectric constant of the subsurface. Okay, and the way we model the roots is basically the same way that we model the branches, or very similar. There are minute differences, but a lot of the strategy is the same. So you divide them up into cylinders, and you find the scattering from the cylinders. Of course, the cylinders are now embedded in the subsurface, in layered ground. So the problem is a little bit more complicated. But again, by dividing them into smaller pieces, we are able to solve them. So the picture on the right is an example of, let's say if you have a plantation and you have this periodic structure of fruits for trees you have planted. And that's kind of represent, we took it from some published literature somewhere. And so the figures on the left show you the sensitivity. So you see that presence or lack of presence of the roots actually also make a pretty significant difference, especially in the cross-polarized channels of the radar. The top picture is the copal channel of the radar, and even then, you see several dB of variation with and without the roots. The bottom picture is the copal channel, the cross-pole channel, where you see all of a sudden there is a huge difference. We're talking about tens of dBs of difference. Because again, these roots are random media, discrete random media, so they tend to produce a lot of cross-polarized backscatter. Okay, so that's that. And so let me see in the next, I have about 10 minutes left, I think. So I have to be a little choosy about what detail I go into in the next few slides. So all of this, I've talked so far about the scattering models, the forward models, the inverse models. If we have measurements, how do we retrieve information from those measurements? But what about the measurements? I mean, let's look at how we would actually perform these measurements, how we form our images. The images basically are what give us the data that we work with, okay? And that's where some of the complication comes in. Okay, so let's say that you have a forested region. I've picked a forested region just to be very general, okay? Because I want to have vegetation on top. I want to be able to assume that I have a layered ground underneath the forest. And so let's say that we launch this fancy radar into space. What happens to the signals that this radar sees? Well, as I've shown you here with the red arrows, the signal hits the trees, hits the ground, and if the frequency is low enough, it's going to penetrate. Okay, and then it comes back towards the radar. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the concepts of synthetic aperture radar processing. But let me just give you a quick, like a 30-second synopsis of that. The way synthetic aperture radar works is that it's a synthetic aperture, which means that it's not a real aperture. Okay, so the real aperture meaning the antenna. Okay, and for the radar, as it moves, the synthetic aperture really contains a history of where the physical aperture has been. So I have an antenna here, my radar moves, the next moment it's here, then it's here, then it's here, so on and so forth. Okay, so these little circles that I've shown, think of those as the physical antenna. Okay, so if your radar, okay, so let's say you have a radar on an aircraft, first it's here, then here, then here, and so on and so forth. This whole length here, this is where the antenna has been, that's your synthetic aperture. Okay, now the reason you use a synthetic aperture is that you end up with a much larger aperture than your physical one. And the larger the aperture, the finer the focus of that aperture is. If you think lens, like in optics, you have the larger lens gives you a much narrower focus. The same concept is true with the SAR systems. Okay, you try to focus finer and finer, right? So for standard SAR processing, what you do is to keep a coherent record of where the antenna has been. You correct for the phases coming in at the different ends of this aperture. Okay, and at the end, just like a lens, like a physical lens, that's what it does. It does this compensation physically. Okay, for SAR systems, we have to do the compensation in signal processing after the fact. Okay, now if everything traveled in free space to your target and back, that's an easy thing to do, relatively easy thing to do, because you know the distance to your target, you know it traveled in free space, so you know exactly how much phase shift it went through. Okay, and that's what standard SAR does. And that's fine, and that's what I've shown here. So the phase difference at every point, n being the nth point, compared to r sub t being the location of the target, that's a known thing. So you can easily compensate for this phase. Okay. Now, what if your target is in the subsurface? How do you generate that image? Well, it's kind of a chicken and egg problem, because you don't know what phase shift it goes through when it goes to the subsurface, because you don't know the permittivity before you solve the problem. Okay, but at the same time, you can't solve the problem if you can't report a number for the backscatter if you don't know what the permittivity of the ground was. Okay, so that's the complexity of forming images with low frequency radars. If you want to generate an image of the subsurface, you already need to know what the permittivity of the subsurface is, and that's a difficult problem. So anyways, you can summarize what I've said in this, that the total phase shift at the locations of the nth point is basically it's the so-called optical phase shift. So it's an integral of all the phase shifts that the wave goes through as it reaches the target, and the phase shifts have to do with the permittivity of the ground. Okay, so the way we have proposed to solve this problem is to solve it iteratively. So as we start forming the image, we assume we know something about the subsurface. It doesn't have to be a right assumption or the correct knowledge of the subsurface. We just assume something in order to get like a first cut at the image. Once we do that, we put it in our parameter estimation or the retrieval algorithm. We come up with a new estimate. We use the new estimate in forming the image again. Okay, and once we have a new image, then we estimate the subsurface parameters again. And we repeat this process until we reach a convergence. Okay, so that has been kind of the physics-based signal processing approach that we have been looking at. And with that, we've shown that you can come up with a pretty decent image of the subsurface. This is a synthetic example. So if you have a subsurface represented by these points, then going through the process that I described, basically you can form the image on the right-hand side. Okay. Now, of course, simulations are good, but experiments are much better, and that's how we have. That's why we have been working on a tower-based radar system. And this shows an actual experiment in Arizona several years ago. Actually, the radar, the top of the. Let me find the cursor. So over here, this is the antenna. Okay, that gets mounted on top of the tower. The tower at first is in horizontal position. You raise it up and then goes up. And this particular tower is about 37 meters high. And then the electronics can sit on the ground. This was the first generation of this radar. It's the electronics. Of course, we have graduated from that a little more. Oh, first let me show you. So this is an actual image of the radar that we acquired. This is from Arizona. The dark line, the black line here, that's the surface. So everything below the surface is our estimate. Well, mind you, we can never fully measure it. I mean, this is just an estimate of the image of the subsurface. This is the HH polarization, VH, a very high frequency, which is 137 megahertz. That's VV. This is higher frequency, 430 megahertz. Top is HH, the bottom is HV. Again, radar images of the subsurface. Now, the second generation is a little better in the sense that it's more compact. So if you remember, let me go back here. So remember this instrument rack, which was very inconvenient. We have reduced that now to a small carry-on size box, basically. And this now doesn't sit on the ground, but it actually sits on top of the tower. It's small enough that we could put it on top of the tower. Makes it much more friendly, user-friendly in the field. And the picture down there is now from, that's in Florida. We just did an experiment there. Just some examples of the measurements with this radar and comparing the results of our measurements and the model. It's not looking good yet because this is just very recent data. We haven't done absolute calibration. It tells us if we're in the right ballpark, but we need to do a lot more massaging of the data and doing a lot of absolute calibration. But it's looking promising. So the next steps for this type of work is that we are taking to air. So this is the Airmass mission that we've been working on. Airmass stands for Airborne Micro Observatory of Subcanopy and Subsurface. We're going to fly a P-band radar on an aircraft. And JPL is building the radar. We have a big team. And it's a big team of radar people, electromagnetics people, and also scientists, hydrologists, carbon cycle scientists, and so forth. Okay, so that's the way it's going to be. It's going to be in a pod. That's the CAD drawing of the radar. And let me see, I'm drawing. And we're going to, our plan is to fly the major biomes of North America and help the carbon scientists to come up with better estimates of the carbon balance for North America. And this is going to happen in the next, we have started it. It's going to go on for another 3 or 4 years. Okay, so let me just close by saying a few kind of very general overview words here. Subsurface sensing, I hope what you can take away from this talk is that its applications rich. It has still many unsolved and challenging problems, both from the physics and engineering perspective and also from the science, the pure science perspective. Okay, so it applies to earth sciences, it applies to exploration, to planetary science and exploration, and it really needs a multidisciplinary approach. It's not like just one type of community can solve the problem. We really need, if you think of a radar system, it has contributions from so many different disciplines. If you're into circuits, into solid state, antennas, numerical techniques, electromagnetics, all of that, they need to be there in order for us to implement a successful radar system with the proper processing and retrieval algorithms. And in particular, environmental sensing problems are in need of such research and such systems. They're very high impact. They are rich with research opportunities. And we know that there's a huge need to solve these problems because we know that our climate is changing. Again, as I mentioned much earlier in the talk, we really need to help people quantify how it's changing. That's really our big role. And the big picture is that we do the sensing part. So over here, sensing, this is where we are now. Okay, what we generate, the knowledge we generate has to go into diagnostics. That's what the scientists do, and the prediction. And then once they do that, then of course it's out of our hands into policy making and how do you mitigate, how do you live with all these changes, and so on and so forth. And there's a huge amounts of investment that goes on both by the government, by the industry. So people have recognized that there's a need here. So there's good opportunities. So both the science community and the agencies are pushing it, and it's really up to us to take advantage of them. So I'm going to finish my talk and would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Questions?
Yes?
How effective is it to model the nonlinear behavior in the system with polynomials? And is it possible to achieve a higher level of accuracy with maybe a different analytical model or something like a neural network?
Okay, so the question is how effective is it to model the nonlinearity of the radar scattering models with polynomials, and whether there are other options besides polynomials to achieve that. Polynomials, in our experience, have been very effective because of their simplicity, right? Because then we don't have to go looking for exotic functions to fit the data too. But your point about how accurate they are, that's a very good point. That's a very good question, because when you do polynomial fits, it could be very dangerous, right? I could fit, let's say if I have 10 points, I want to fit a polynomial. I could give you a ninth order polynomial that exactly fits that function, but it looks like that. It's an overfit, basically. So we have to find a balance of accuracy and the quality of fit, okay? Our solution to that, we have observed issues with that, actually. And our solution to that has been that we actually divide the big data space. If I can find this thing. So if you remember that picture, so this data space, and I've shown you a very simplified one. Oftentimes, it has variations. It has much more nonlinearity that I've shown here. What we do is we divide up the data space into subspaces. And within each subspace, we try to limit the order of the polynomial to 3 or 4, no more than that, because we have seen that if you go over 4th degree polynomials, you end up with overfitting situations, and those are not physical. So we divide up into subspaces. You could definitely search for other type of nonlinear functions, but again, that's an open-ended problem.
Any other questions?
So, in the beginning, you talked about carbon cycle, but your talk largely was about inverse imaging of subsurface and subsurface features. What is the relationship between the two, if I...
Sure. Yeah, the question is, what's the relationship between subsurface imaging or sensing and the carbon cycle? So the connection is not immediately clear, but it turns out there's a big connection in the sense that root zone soil moisture determines the functioning of the trees, of the vegetation. Okay, so how much the trees grow or don't grow really has to do with how much water they have available at their roots. So that's the connection. And it's really the connection between the water cycle and the carbon cycle. So, and it's one of the major things. So people have shown that about 60 to 80% of the uncertainty in the carbon models could be due to the lack of knowledge about the root zone soil moisture. So again, it's kind of a, it's not a very obvious, intuitive connection, but there is just, because like your house plant, if you don't water it, it's going to die, right? I mean, no leaves, the carbon is lost. So it's the functioning of the roots.
So one question, you talked mostly about the sensing aspect. What about the calibration of the data? I mean, can you comment a little bit about that? And
the question is about the calibration of the data. I guess how does calibration impact the accuracy of our results? And the answer is a lot. So we have to be very careful in calibrating our systems. For example, for the Airmass mission that I talked about at the very last, the airborne radar that we are building, we found that to achieve our accuracy goals for soil moisture, and I didn't really talk about that, our goal for soil moisture accuracy is about 5%. That's the number we're shooting for, 5% volumetric soil moisture. To achieve that accuracy with our models, okay, we have gone through some uncertainty and error analysis, and we have shown that we need to achieve 0.5 dB calibration on our system. So it's not a trivial thing. And if you go, and the problem is that, as for example, as soil moisture increases, there is this so-called saturation effect. So your backscattering cross-section basically levels out, right? So if you keep pouring water, okay, the backscattering cross-section doesn't go up, right? So if you're up at the high range of the backscattering cross-section or soil moisture, okay, you're very sensitive to this calibration. So if your signal's intrinsic variation, let's say, is only 0.8 dB or 1 dB, okay, but your calibration is also about the same level, of course, you're not going to get good results as a result of your estimation algorithm. So the calibration has to be commensurate with the variability of your signal, and we found that to reach this 5% accuracy for the entire range that we're interested in, we need to have 0.5 dB accuracy, calibration accuracy.
In your inverse scattering problem, you say you also get some kind of ground truth data to do the validation, and seems working okay. But have you ever used those validation data, try to refine the model or make it iterative? Because when we do a lot of interpolation issue, if I know some ground truths, I have all different kind of iterative procedure to, for example, changing the regularization parameter, changing the polynomial order, since I know those ground truths. Have you ever done that?
That's a very good point. So the question is, have we taken advantage of our ground truth in the actual estimation problem to come up with better regularizations and basically calibrate our models? We haven't done it yet, but that's that's a really necessary thing that we need to do. So for the course, in the course of the Airmass mission, that is actually one of our plans, because we have also deployed a pretty extensive set of in situ measurements, ground truth points. And we do plan actually to use that to refine our estimation approach. The least we can do is that we can actually remove a bias, at least, from our estimates. That's the least we can do. But your point that you could even use it to fine-tune your regularization function or covariance functions, for example, in the regularization process, that's definitely something we need to take advantage of. Yeah, but we haven't done it yet.
Any other questions?
The in situ measurements, you do those in each of the biomes, then basically each of the majors.
Yes. Right, so the question was for the Airmass mission, that's what you're asking. Do we do the in situ measurements at every one of those biomes, the 9 biomes that I showed? And the answer is yes, we have. So the baseline plan is that we have already deployed 3 points at each of these biomes. Of course, 3 points is nothing for a whole biome, but those are collecting data continuously already. With respect to time. But during the overflights, our plan also is to be in the field. So we're going to have large teams deployed on the ground at the time of the flights with probes in the field, many, many sample points in the field.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mahta.
Thank you.